first TAPAS lecture in the new series of this year, Practicing History in Super Diverse Societies, where we investigate what the implications of super diversity are for various practices of doing history, and we do this in 4 different so-called contact zones for museums, heritage sites, educational settings, and the academic world. But before we start this really applied part of the series, we want to think about what super diversity means, what it means as a perspective, as a descriptive tool, what perhaps its limitations are, which is why we invited Karel to present on this topic today. I'll read a bit from my paper. Karel is Associate Professor and Research Coordinator of the Interculturalism, Migration and Minorities Research Center at the University of Leuven. He previously worked here at the Department of African Languages and Culture in Ghent University, and he was Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the study of religious and ethnic diversity in Ghent. Karel's research focuses on articulations and representations of cultural and linguistic super diversity in migration-driven contexts in European and African urban transnational spaces. Before we start with the lecture, I would like to make 2 just practical comments. First, we are very grateful that we can have this session here at the AMSAB. We had an issue with the coffee, but if you really have a very urgent need for coffee, the bar is just across from here. So that's what on that topic. And then second, we are organizing this workshop series with money from the doctoral schools. That also means that we have to prove to the doctoral schools that this really happened, which then again means that you have to put your name and signature on a list which I will circulate here. So I'll start with you and giving the word to Mr. Arnaut. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's also filmed, so I'll prove that we were here. I was not entirely sure how to set it up, so we're going to try something. I'll do this in 2 parts. I thought first, this is a history setting, isn't it? So we should do something with history. And I would like to kind of more or less read a short statement entitled A Personal History of Super Diversity, which gives you a bit of a peek behind the emergence of the concept within a particular institutional setting of which I was part. So I thought that may give it a kind of a historical flavor. But more than that, we should also, because it is a concept that has a very kind of recent history, so it's actually interesting as such to see how such concepts come about and circulate and are appropriated and so on. So I can perhaps say something about that. So that is part 1, which is a kind of an oral history. There won't be any slides for that. And then we'll move on to part 2. So in between we can have just a couple questions perhaps. Part 2 in which I'm trying to tell you how I moved on and how others, or some others at least, moved on from the time, from the early days of super diversity, which date back, as you know, to 2007. Because, I mean, to inform yourself about the context, the concept as such, and you've obviously read some of the texts, basic texts concerning super diversity. So there's no point in me kind of re-explaining that again. But somehow connecting to the concerns formulated in the first part of my lecture, I'll try to explain how we can take super diversity, which is obviously very tested kind of thing. How we can take it further, and how I did this in work I did recently, or I'm preparing, stuff like that. So I'll illustrate it a little bit. Okay. We could just have the next slide, or the one after that. Okay. So, there is a kind of mantra, a set phrase in many of the texts you've come across, in which it is said that superdiversity is a term coined in 2007 by Steve Vertovec. I just want to explain a little bit what that actually involved. Now, Stephen is an anthropologist who, in the course of his impressive career, rapidly becomes what one could call an institution builder. First, he was director of TAPAS, the Center on Migration Policy and Society, University of Oxford, and co-director of IMI, the Institute for International Migration. And from 2007 onwards, the same 2007 as in the mantra, term coined, etc., etc., director of the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Ethnic and Religious Diversity, Göttingen. For those who are not familiar with the structure of these Max Planck Institutes, each institute is built around one or more central academics, the directors with an idea for a research program, really. And not any academic with any old idea, but let's say a kind of super academic with a kind of super idea. Just to give you a short idea of what that implies, I mean, if they're in looking for a director, a Max Planck Institute will shortlist, okay, a number of candidates, and they will take the number one, obviously, on the shortlist, okay. But if the number one refuses to join the Max Planck Institute as a director, the shortlist is destroyed, because they cannot imagine taking the number two, because that would not be excellent enough for the Max Planck Institute. So they start all anew. Okay. Anyway, so that gives you an idea of how these directors are kind of seen. Around this person, come idea, a mini institute is built, consisting of dozens of researchers, PhDs, and postdocs, technical, administrative staff. Now, Steve Vertovec's Max Planck Institute project revolved around superdiversity. And very soon after, he also received an ERC advanced grant to try out his ideas in 2 different cities, New York, Singapore, and Johannesburg. So-called Diverse Cities project, about which I will say something in the second part. Very quickly, the term superdiversity started to circulate and was also picked up by a number of social linguists. Well, you may be familiar with Jan Blommaert, the other one was Ben Ramsey. In the meantime, Steve was organizing the uptake of his notion in at least 2 ways. First of all, by doing policy-oriented diversity analyses of main German cities, such as Frankfurt and Berlin, and a couple of others, producing these charts, which you've probably seen the amount of super diversity for a particular, in a particular city. And B, by setting up a number of working groups, which were coordinated by someone within the institute, but consisted of academics from outside, mainly Europe, and to some extent Africa and the US. And one of these working groups was the working group on social linguistics of superdiversity, which I was to coordinate for the 2 years I was there. And although I'm slightly biased, I must say that this working group was by far the largest and also the most active, but take my word for it. There were other working groups working, for instance, on markets or on medical diversity. So there were, I think, 5 in total. From the very start, this working group also had a public face, that of an international consortium, later named the International Consortium of Language and Superdiversity. Moreover, most of the activity of the working group and the consortium called INCOLAS was situated outside the Max Planck Institute in meetings, project proposals, and the preparation of publications that were organized by the different institutional partners in a number of cities and universities in Europe, South Africa, Cape Town, but also Egypt, and so on. Given the relative peripheral place of Göttingen as a village, as a small town, the question how central superdiversity was to the activities of the working group at INCOLAS is a legitimate one. The nuanced answer is that it was often mentioned. I mean, superdiversity was often mentioned. It was always on our mind, but not really guiding our joint activities or deeply affecting our individual or separate research projects. Okay? So it was actually something around which we came together that we did not, I think, not really help very much theorizing, conceptualizing the concept. Neither did Steve Vertevec, but that's another question. Superdiversity, I dare say, was a notion that animated our academic socialization and collaboration rather than orienting, let alone plotting out our research trajectories. And I dare say that this was very much the case of the other working groups as well. There was, of course, a founding document which was the working group's manifesto written by Blomberg and Rampton, kind of position paper. And the question there is, perhaps, I'm referring to that in the text, the emerging perspective text, which some of you read. The question there is, did it introduce the social linguistics of superdiversity? And I submit that the extensive paper does not say very much about superdiversity at all. What it gave us was an excellent state of the art of the social linguistics of globalization, and if you like, diversity. It gave a promise that this toolkit, which it presented, could be used to develop a social linguistics of superdiversity. But the toolkit was actually never kind of put to work. Parallel with this, there were attempts to scale up the epistemic reach of that new concept. And this was mainly done in response to emerging critiques, such as one can be found in a number of articles and books published at the time. What was the meaning of that super? Okay. Was it indicating a new enhanced diversity reality or a new vigorous way of looking at diversity? So, you know, it's either an empirical reality or indeed a kind of method perspective for that. The opinions among the members of the INCOLAS consortium differed between the grand idea that superdiversity was a new paradigm of understanding how diversity pervades and transforms our social and communicative lives and worlds, to the more moderate option that superdiversity was merely a summary term, indicating an epochal shift in the relative complexity of diversity, and this shift was then situated in the early 1990s, let's say. Okay. And there was the in-between position, which is sort of mine, I think, that it was an emerging perspective, a term with enormous potential if properly theorized and methodologically situated within the social and human sciences. And that's what my text was about. And we can discuss that later on if you wish. Although some of the elements from that text I elaborate on later. Looking back, has the social linguistics of super diversity lived up to its expectations? And I think perhaps, it's a bit of a cynical note perhaps, but the torchbearers' recent publications speak for themselves. Blommaert's latest offering, Durkheim and the Internet, published last year, mentions super diversity only once and in a footnote. While in a broad overview on the uptake of the concept, Steve Verteweg, in a 2019 article, does not mention any of the publications on language and super diversity, with the exception of one reference to the work of the working group in general. Okay? So that's something which indicates, I think, how the kind of methodological, theoretical work that was taking place within the working group around that concept was not very much flowing back into. And that was very much the same for the other working groups. And I think that was perhaps a mistake, but that's a bit judgmental very early on in this talk. So what has become of this promising notion of super diversity? And again, I start from within the social linguistic angle, but gradually, as you will see, I'll move on beyond that. First of all, I mean, in general, I would say that the notion was a heuristically productive one. It stimulated our discussions on diversity in sort of three directions, which will guide me then also in part 2 of my talk. The discussions about diversity generated deep questions about where super diversity comes from, where it is produced, so to speak. And here I think we found that what was missing was both a kind of political economy of super diversity as well as a governmentality of super diversity. And I think I addressed that in a sense in the paper on the emerging perspectives. But then there I rephrased it, or I addressed it as a problem, an issue of post-coloniality, together with the whole idea of, let's say, the new panopticon, or the post-panopticon. Interestingly enough, in a recent paper by Susan Hall, who's been engaging with the notion of super diversity in her work on, let's say, shopping streets in different places in the UK, in cities. But she has actually taken this critique up, and the title is Mooring Super Diversity to a Brutal Migration Milieu. And she's actually asking the question there, what about the political economy of this behind the super diversity, the brutal categorizations taking place within the migration regimes that are operating in our societies. Okay? So that was the first kind of set of issues. Secondly, discussions about where super diversity was at work. We explored a range of different sites, from online, offline, local and global, public and private, urban and more kind of marginal, if you like, peripheral. Traces of these reflections can be found in an introductory chapter I co-authored for another edited volume on super diversity. I don't know if you've come across that one, and there I formulated around the notions of poiesis and infrastructure. It will be this kind of infrastructure thing that I'll work further in the future. Finally, the interlast discussions obviously focused on what the outcomes of this diversity or super diversity work in language, in cultural production, whatever, in social interaction and so on was. Not only in terms of all these products, but also, and more importantly, on how it affected people's lives and positions, identities, subjectivities. Okay, what kind of people was super diversity kind of producing, so to speak? And these ideas were later and only recently, in my case, repackaged in the work I'm doing now around the concept of arrival infrastructures, together with a number of others, as well as in the research on seasonal labor migration, about which I will be telling you something in the second part. So there is an interesting and very productive range of questions about subjectivation and what kind of what super diversity has to offer to understand how people realize themselves within super diverse environments, with super diverse resources, if you like, and how this needs to be seen at an individual level, but also in terms of the re-emergence or creation of what Apadula would call large-scale identities in all sorts of ways. And racialization is becoming a key issue, also addressed in one of the papers by Susan Hall in connection with super diversity. How deep these go together. Okay, second point. In the human and social sciences in general, super diversity is often used as I said, a summary term, indicate a new historical condition emerging in the 1990s. At best, super diversity is meant to indicate also a new, open, let's say, I call it here an agnostic way of looking at the complexity of diversity, freed from the old obsessions with ethnicity and nationality, and by extension, multiculturality. Here it comes very near to intersectionality, which seems for many to offer a more modest, not this kind of super thing, but more modest, analytically equally powerful and less celebratory way of doing what super diversity was after. Finally, in the more applied sectors of the social sciences, for instance, social work, and among civil society actors, super diversity has made a deep impression, but much depends on who introduced or spread it in particular countries or regions. For instance, in the UK, you would find that the work of Crease and Blackridge, as well as Jenny Phillimore, who's created that Institute for Research into Super Diversity in Birmingham, was important for its popular uptake. While in Flanders and Netherlands, there was the accessible work of people like Jan Blommaert, Ico Mali, Dirk Heldhoff, and Marcel Krol, which means that I think many people in Flanders, for instance, would not necessarily know what super diversity is, but many would have heard of it. Well, that would be completely different in France, for instance, or in Germany. Not entirely sure about Germany, but definitely France. And I think, at least in Flanders, it is interesting how the institutional origin of the term, as well as the fact that it was popularized by, let's say, public intellectuals, this has helped activists to position super diversity as a kind of a super term, so to speak, sophisticated, academically backed, in order to question and disrupt entrenched diversity regimes and ideology of static multiculturalism, monolingualism, unidirectional integration and stuff like that. So it has done interesting work, I think, in the popular discourses on diversity, for instance, in Flanders and the Netherlands. So that's kind of the institutional history, so to speak, of this super diversity term from my angle and from my experiences. And I think perhaps in the future, kind of meta studies can be done on how such terms circulate, what determines the uptake and stuff like that. So that's the first part. Is there any questions? Perhaps you have a look at it. Yeah. Shall I continue? Okay, let's go. Okay, so part 2 is beyond superdiversity, towards the superdiversity 2.0 perhaps. Doesn't matter how you call it. Perhaps we may shed the whole idea of superdiversity in the end. I don't think it's now that the institution has been built around it, so it's very much there. And it is for us to do with it whatever we think is productive and useful, rather than enter into endless discussions about what it really means, things like that. Okay, where do we start in moving away from superdiversity while still trying to recuperate or engage with some of the ideas that seem to be connected to the term? And so I think more or less corresponding to the 3 issues which I raised earlier on, I asked these three questions, and I refer back to elements in the work of Steve Wertherweg about superdiversity or diversity to take this further. Perhaps that's kind of the sort of work one would expect from Steve Wertherweg himself, reconnecting with his own ideas to further superdiversity, which he has only done to a very limited extent, I think. Okay, so where is superdiversity produced, reproduced? And this brings us into the dimensions of power and inequality. Interestingly enough, I don't know if you're familiar with this, I would say, seminal text by Wertherweg on diversity, which was published in the journal Sociology, I think. A very informative history of the concept of diversity and how it emerged out of the civil rights movement. And in the process, other minorities along ethnic lines, nationalities, gender lines, ability, disability, and so on, joining in the quest for recognition, affirmation, and multiplying, so to speak, the concept of diversity and making it into a major term. I think Wertherweg talks about diversity as a social imaginary, a guiding kind of metaphor, if you like, of how you imagine the world to be. And I think it is important that he points out that the origins are somehow in this affirmative action, and in fact directly related to racial issues, yeah, which seem to be now, over the last years, to be readdressed and questioned or brought into the discussion again. So, in his text, he opens reflections on diversity management, going beyond diversity policies. He's not using words like governmentality or biopolitics, but you can feel that we're very near there. How this kind of structuring thoughts about how to manage, organize society. So that's the first thing. The second line along which one could develop super diversity is by asking the question, where does it happen, where is it taking place? And here we can take a cue from Vertevek's work on within the Diverse Cities project, and his work on urban topography of super diversity. And finally, what does it result in? What does it produce? And here I think that we have a couple of ideas by Vertevek, but most of it needs to be kind of invented from scratch. Right. Let's go to the next slide. As I already said, I think we need kind of a political economy of super diversity or migration-driven super diversity. Here I cannot go into much detail, but what I found particularly inspiring is the work coming out of a group of scholars who work around the idea of the autonomy of migration. You may be familiar with their work, which is explicitly very Marxist, but has among its members or contributors major academics such as De Genova, Papadopoulos, Tsianos, Mesadra, and so on and so forth. Very quickly, I put a number of quotes here which gives you some of the idea behind the autonomy of migration, which I think was very much also a concern of the working group on super diversity, as I pointed out below. What they're actually pointing towards is that there is a kind of a force within the processes of capital accumulation that nevertheless precedes and exceeds any of the powers mobilized to contain and subordinate it. So there is an excess of if you like, mobility power among migrants, which cannot be contained fully by the system, whether you call it capitalism or any other term. So they're particularly using terms like vitality of bodies and minds as living labor, things like that. So migration for these people is a conceptual move to unify migrants in their struggle for movement, confronting regimes of immobilization, of control of movement, of producing governable subjects of mobility, as Papadopoulos and Tsianos call it. And I think this was very much also the kind of what I would call the liberatory potential of super diversity, which is very much part of the imaginaries within the working group. The enormous kind of semiotic vitality which came out of the new diversity we were facing, and that this was could not be contained by all kinds of attempts from above, if you like, to regiment, to categorize, and so on, this vitality. Okay. So that's so much for the unifying thing. Okay. So where does the diversity then comes from? And that is in the next slide. So what the same group and people related to it come up with is a theory, if you like, or a whole set of interrelated reflections on borders, and more specifically what they call the multiplication of borders. Okay. And I quote here from the Genova and others. Migration has become turbulent, leading to a multiplication of statuses, subjective position, and experiences within citizenship regimes and labor markets. So they actually see a combination of state and capital, okay, trying in their attempts to control and regiment this vitality of labor and movement, creating all sorts of categories, yeah? And so diversifying, so to speak, the group of migrants who should not forget that they are actually part or member of the same mobile proletariat. Let me put it in these terms now. Okay? Importantly, the heterogenizing effects of power should not be confused here with the multiplicity of mobile subjectivities and struggles. Okay? So there is a multiplicity of subjectivities and struggles taking place or forming within that larger unity, but that does not is not the same, is not following the same, if you like, distinctions as the one imposed on it from or through the state and through capital. Okay. So these mobile subjectivities and struggles are effaced at the expense of making clearly defined heterogeneous objects of governance. Okay. So there is a struggle going on over diversity, so to speak. There is a diversity, to put it simply, from below, okay, originating from or becoming, to use the Leuven term, through interactions, through the vitality of interactions of labor and mobility, which is then is regimented and categorized from above. And if you go back to the early texts of Steve Werteweg, the 2007 text, it's very weird how he talks about these categories or facets of diversity. It is as if these are like analytically given, okay? But what the autonomists, as I call them, say is that you should situate them somewhere. Either they're coming from below, they're relevant from below, or indeed they are imposed on migrants from above. Okay? And again, I mean, within a system of or a framework of governmentality, the above and below kind of are more complexly related, but we cannot go into the fine details of that. So I think that was very early on for us a kind of a critique that Steve Werteweg was not very clear what the status of these categories actually were. And he should have situated that within, as I call it here, a kind of a political economy within which diversity from below, from above, is produced. Okay. Okay, perhaps we should not at this point, yeah, just perhaps referring to one particular case on which we've been reflecting with a number of people that the category of trans migrants has been flourishing in Belgium and Flanders public discourse, but also in policies and so on and so forth. Where does that term come from? Okay, you can say, oh, there's a new category there. Okay, a new category which has some analytical purchase. But actually, we need to see more. First of all, how it is introduced from above, if you like, through policy makers in policy documents, but also in the documents that are leading towards police action, so direct confrontation with this supposedly unified group of people. That's one way of looking at it. There's always another way of looking at it, saying how relevant is that term for the people themselves? How much do they see each other as a kind of unity? How much kind of commoning, so to speak, is taking place from below? Yeah. Another interesting case I came across recently in a paper. I've got the reference here if you like, by Kristen Veal. It's a work doing work in Istanbul. And what is interesting there is that she's looking into housing within what she calls a super diverse neighborhood. Okay, and so she's getting away from let's say the usual categories and looking into, for instance, or among others, two terms of people saying, I don't rent to bachelors, I address myself to families. And then she's unpacking what people actually mean by bachelors. What's the ethnic, religious profile of these bachelors? Okay, and what's the case for families? Okay, referring to different cohorts, let's say, of migrants that have come into Istanbul for the last over the last decades. So what you see there is an actors category of categorization emerging, which helps homeowners to order the kind of diversity they are addressing and talk about it and manage it. Anyway, so that's the first kind of possibility of developing a super diversity backed up by a kind of political economy framework. Okay. The same thing is happening, I can talk about that later on if you are interested, is something I address in my work on seasonal migrant labor in Haspenau, fruit business, fruit picking business in that part of Flanders. And here also, I'm starting from, if you like, a super diversity framework, looking at, taking into account things like legal statuses. Okay, so here we are with a group of workers. Some of them are Eastern European seasonal workers. Others are people with a North African background who have been living in Italy for 2 decades, moved on after the crisis in 2008 to Brussels and are now living in very precarious circumstances and do commute to Sint-Truiden, which is kind of the main city there, to work in that kind of business, having no kind of social protection whatsoever. But there are others, there are elder Sikh, people from the Punjab who migrated into the region decades ago and have been involved in the fruit picking ever since. In fact, it was the Sikh who kicked off the globalization of that whole family-based fruit business in the 1980s. And so, while the Sikh have been moving out of this, other cohorts, other groups, among them also at some point, many Africans from Brussels commuting into Sint-Truiden to do business, to work in the fruit picking. Okay. So, when addressing the kind of diversity of these laborers, these workers, it is important to see the larger picture, the larger history also of the political economy behind it. The second slide. Oh, that was the one I was reading. There we go. So the second line along which one could develop super diversity was that of time and space. What kind of spaces are produced through super diversity? And there I found the work of Verterweg, which he did in the context of diverse cities, of the big ERC project, actually quite useful. I'll just give a number of examples of how he tried to introduce new terms of spatial ordering or reordering of cities within the situations of or contexts of dynamics of super diversity, such as routines. I don't know how to pronounce that correctly. Rooms without walls and corridors of dissociation. You can see, so in his routines, he was much more interested in kind of trajectories within a particular neighborhoods or cities, which were built around encounters and fleeting interactions, as he calls them, along habitually traveled pathways or routes to work, shopping, leisure, and so on. So along these, the trajectories that people make through cities, they kind of form or pick up cultural, linguistic resources, but also interact with people and position themselves. Okay. Another thing which was quite big was his work on public spaces, parks, public transport, food courts and stuff like that, where people kind of met, interacted in all sorts of different ways. And the last one is more looking into, it's more trying to find terms which can capture forms of segregation, if you like, exclusion that is being spatialized, and through which people are channeled into particular, if you like, ghettos or other kind of secluded spaces within the city. Okay, so I think there is a couple of interesting concepts to engage with, and in which the people of the working group at the time were also very much interested in. I think that the time-space terminology helped us, and also me in some of my work, to to see how people invent or the places they occupy. And one of the terms that has cropped up there was that of chronotopes, which again is being used in all sorts of very fancy ways to show how people, for instance, imagine their neighborhood in relation to other spaces within the city or other spaces, other transnational spaces, and so on and so forth, giving it a kind of a sense of place, if you like, but also a sense of where is it in history. Okay, does it belong to the past? Has it openings to the future? Things like that. So there is time considerations there are very important. And all this comes back in a new terminology, which also partly relates to what the autonomists are saying, that of the mobile commons, which I think is a very productive way of trying to see what people who may come from different parts of the world think about migrants being from West Africa, East Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, ending up in more or less the same spaces in Istanbul or Greece, okay? Either forced to stay there or somehow find a place to arrive there, to dwell, to start a new life. How they exchange all sorts of things, how they share all sorts of things. And Papadopoulos and Tsianos have made an interesting kind of checklist, if you like, of the things that are shareable. And it can be knowledge, infrastructures of connectivity, informal economies or economic interactions, but also advocacy, and finally what they call a politics of care. Okay, and it is of mutual cooperation and so on. So these are things which need to be studied ethnographically and will, I think, generate whole new insights of how people create new mobile worlds, if you like, increasingly as globalization continues. Okay. The same can be, as I already said, can be addressed when thinking about trans migrants, and in order to capture the commoning dynamics of what is happening there, we, together with a number of other people, started to think around the concept of arrival infrastructures, which are kind of temporary moments and sites of landing, of settlement, of dwelling, which are indeed consist of a double dynamic of, you know, states, authorities, police trying to locate these people, to block these people, to regiment them into certain channels, while the others, the people themselves, resisting this or negotiating this or ending up in what you would call infrastructural struggles, as we call them, taking place between different actors. Okay, and finally, what kind of subjects, as I already said, what kind of subjectivities are being produced by super diversity? And there is a huge, how would I say, terrain of research possible, not only within anthropology or history for that matter, but far beyond. And I think there we need to, what is important is that we take on board ideas, for instance, developed by Jacques Rancière around the idea of political subjectivity or political subjectification, which involves always a kind of an attempt to transcend, to exceed, remember the early autonomous term, to transgress the categories that are imposed on somebody, okay? And so rework that categorization in all sorts of different ways. There's lots of text there which is trying to explain what I'm trying to say, but I think that's kind of the gist of it. Okay, I think we'll also find this in the case of trans migrants and their attempts at mobile dwelling, but it also came out of my work on seasonal workers, fruit pickers, and it would take a bit of a long explanation to tell you what is happening here. I'm sorry, the explanation is, oh, sorry, yeah.
This one?
Please, yeah, next one. There you go. Doesn't matter so much. But what you see here is a kind of a stylized drawing of a shed where fruit pickers have their lunch. Okay, and I was trying to work out, to map, so to speak, that thing as a kind of a chronotope. Okay, so they have all kinds of hierarchized and even racialized positions as workers in the fields. Okay, so that's quite clear. When then they come together, okay, it's an interesting case study by people connected to the project on superdiversity by Stijn Oosterling. Has been working on around the concept of conviviality. What kind of super diverse conviviality can emerge from such a moments of getting together? I was rather looking at the other side, the non-convivial thing, and see how the hierarchies, the racialization, the categorization was enacted by people with very different backgrounds. So there's people who consider themselves as locals, okay, local policemen, often very people who are in the army, have time to spare to come and do some fruit picking during their extensive holidays, apparently. So speaking a local dialect, okay, there are elder Sikh people who come to do some fruit picking during a couple of weeks or months, speaking also the local dialect, but then let's say Sikh accented, to say the least. There are people from Poland, from Romania, so the Eastern Europeans are there as well as the category I briefly mentioned, let's say the Belgian allochtones with a Maghrebi background who commute from Brussels and are in the most vulnerable position. And so I was, apart from the fact that, so this is kind of high status, here you would find the native, so to speak, speaking local dialect. Here there's a kind of intermediary zone, okay, accommodating Eastern Europeans, while here you would find the Belgian allochtones outside. But I was particularly following one of them, it's called Abdul, you can bring, because he ends up in three different positions, both here, which is kind of just outside the shed, under the trees, okay, also here in front of the shed, and then sometimes he's also kind of moving around in this in this space. And I was particularly interested in how he tried to negotiate his way into this zone, okay? Even going as far as trying to transgress in that particular zone and using all kinds of, let's say, resources he had at his disposal. One of these resources was French, okay, which I spoke, but I was about the only one to speak French among all the people there. So that was a reason why he could come in and address me in French. I was mainly sort of in between this and this zone. That was my space. So he was using French, which sort of was, well, ambivalently seen by the natives, because their French was kind of limited. They found it kind of annoying that there was a kind of a, that we share the language, but also what he said. I mean, he spoke about his time in Italy, and he would say, "Oh, have you visited Firenze?" or "I've been in Paris. Have you visited this?" And so also he was using these kind of experiences, his, let's say, translocal knowledge or experience, to upgrade himself from the very low position in which he was. Okay, so there was a whole, I mean, on a daily basis, a kind of choreography of using the bits and pieces that were there in his life to negotiate a way into the more privileged zones, and while constantly being kind of pushed back and told off and treated often in a very explicitly racist way by the natives. So for me that was a very super diverse kind of environment, or at least that was an environment, a chronotope, which I was able to kind of start analyzing using tools that came out of super diversity, and I leave it there. Thank you. Was I too long?
I don't think so, no. We also started with the data. Thank you so much for this really very intriguing talk. I have lots of questions, but I first want to give the floor to you guys. Ask what comes up. Julia?
Hi. Thank you, Karel. That was really interesting. But I have a question, and maybe it's because I don't know the literature on super diversity very well. But like the dynamics and the processes that you are describing, how specific are they for super diversity? Because I've been working on mobile people in colonial contexts, and many of the dynamics that you described, even for that last part, they kind of echo in what I see or what I saw. And in that sense, so it's a difference then that, well, that is it then in the super diversity, because the processes and the dynamics seem very, what is the difference then with these colonial contexts, and what makes super diversity then something that is exceptional? And yeah.
Yeah, I think you gather very well from what I have been saying, is that there is no such thing as, you know, the whole idea of seeing super diversity as a kind of a summary term, you know, situating it either in Europe or in the UK even, because it, you know, was in the context of Steve Vertevec looking into the migration diversity situation in London. So then he generalized this to the post, you know, Berlin Wall kind of dynamics on a global scale, and gradually also found that, yeah, there was more going on than just the Berlin Wall and the end of the East-West kind of division, but that, you know, similar, or yeah, perhaps new mobilities were arising during that period in different parts of the world. it was the fall, also the end of apartheid, which was by excellence a way of ordering people in spatially regimenting people, to say the least, apart from categorizing, racializing, and so on and so forth. So you could find additional arguments to say, yes, something new happened there. And I'm sure it made, I mean, all these things made a real difference on migratory movements and stuff like that, because, you know, a number of borders indeed were collapsing and allowed people to move around. But they, you know, this building of borders and the collapse of them, you know, that's a story that, you know, goes back centuries. So indeed, there for me, that was not, you know, a very kind of credible way of dealing with super diversity. And so, you know, even people say, oh, this is a particular super diverse neighborhood. I don't think that makes sense, really. I mean, how are you going to measure that? I remember that my last kind of intervention in Göttingen at the time, where we had to kind of, you know, we were invited to share our ideas about super diversity, and my slogan was stop counting, okay? Stop counting ethnicities, nationalities, languages, and so on and so forth, because that's not what I think super diversity is about. It's about combinations of, yeah, very much the kind of, how would I say, diversities, as I presented them at the very beginning, coming from below, if you like, out of the vitality, either in terms of mobility or symbiotic or whatever. You know. So no, and apart from that, there has not been a kind of you cannot define a super diversity method or theory, or, you know, so it's just like one way of entering the diversity debate, and I think super diversity for me was an interesting one, and it opened kind of, helped me to reflect on all the kinds of things which I have been presenting, but which now sort of fall outside the purview of super diversity. Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question, but you can come to what you're studying, you know, from different angles. Okay, you can start diversifying, you know, ideas around race and racism, and say, okay, we need to see that in a more, you know, nuanced way. And so, you know, while from super diversity you start from a huge, you know, scala of diversity, you try to narrow it down also to see what kind of new categorizations, if you call meta groups or super groups, are forming out of this immense diversity. Yeah, new conglomerates, if you like. Yeah.
A lot of things to think about. But
Yeah, true. Yes.
I was wondering if you could go back to the slide about diversities. Yeah, it's fine. It's not entirely clear to me how I should understand the relationship between these three elements. Like, yeah, how I should, in one place or time-space constellation, be one thing or two things or three things at the same time, or like, how should I conceptualize these routines, rules that goes and
I think they were presented as analytical terms which would help to, if you like, typologize spatial dynamics in the three cities and the consideration there that was Singapore, New York, and Johannesburg. Okay, so Steve, they're trying to develop a new, if you like, analytical toolkit that sort of displaced existing terms such as ghettos or neighborhoods or ethnic neighborhoods, you know, getting away a bit from that, let's say, established terminology and, you know, reflect upon how, because these are, you know, apart from being spaces, they're also, they point towards an interaction pattern or process through which these spaces are being produced. And so he was inviting the scholars or the research in the different sites to kind of identify, you know, routines or what was, you know, or rooms without walls and stuff like that in these different cities. It's not much more than that. How they are interrelated, I wouldn't know. I mean, you can have, you know, routines connecting different rooms without walls, if you like, things like that. But that was not so much his concern. Yeah. Perhaps I'm trying to indicate that most of the work that Steve and his nearest ERC collaborators were doing was methodological and analytical, not so much kind of theoretical or conceptualizing superdiversity. Hence, it's a kind of a weak concept. There is an imbalance between the amount of institutionalization that took place, you know, coming from that prestigious site, Max Planck and so on and so forth, and the way it was theoretically kind of supported, elaborated. Yeah.
Is it?
Yeah.
So would you say it's not en vogue anymore, superdiversity? As you mentioned some of its torchbearers don't use it anymore, etc. So it was one of those things that could go in and out of vogues.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I think it as far as I can see, it will kind of wither away in the next decade, unless somebody, as a concept, I mean, as a concern, as a scholarly thing to engage with. I see it popping up here and there, people trying something with it, like, you know, interestingly, Susan Hall, but as far as I can see, it's not going to, it's not driving, how would I say, research in the social and human sciences.
Is it still funded? I mean, is it sexy if you use it in a funding application, or is that ridiculous?
Yeah, yes.
It still is?
It is tricky. I remember being part of applications for groups, you know, for funding, and people say try to avoid superdiversity.
So now you have to avoid it.
Yeah.
Well, 10 years ago it cashed.
Yeah. Because it has some kind of outspoken enemies. Even, I mean, imagine an interesting case of Nina Glick-Schiller, okay, who's, in fact, who's very much, how would I say, an early collaborator or colleague, rather, of Steve Vertevec. And out of her reflections on transnationalism, which date back to the early 90s, she was connected to the other Max Planck Institute in Halle, still is. So they actually, I think, out of these discussions with her, I can see how the idea of superdiversity came about. And I think in her early publications, she was not using it very often, but she was, you know, while in the latest one, what is it, Migrants as City Makers, published last year, introduction, violently against superdiversity and conviviality and what I somewhere got here, open airism. That was one of my critiques on superdiversity. There was, you know, in a kind of naive way, looking at the interactions taking place across all kinds of, you know, boundaries of diversity in public spaces or in semi-public spaces. So she was, in her introduction to that book, she's very much, you could say bashing, even with rather bad arguments. Yeah, because one of the driving ideas, there was an ideology behind the super diversity thing I referred to, is that he was trying to show that, this whole idea of the association that migration went together with, let's say, social disintegration, and related issues of cultural alienation or whatever you want to call it. So societal disintegration. And he was showing that people would actually collaborate and did things together, made spaces, interacted, exchanged, and so on. And something, new things came out of it. Okay. So he was trying to build a kind of positive image of migration during that time, which was very much, I think, established in the UK at that time. Look at what Gilroy was saying about multicultural and so on and so forth, and that has a history in the Birmingham school. So he was trying to formulate that argument. Now, Schiller is saying in the recent chapter, introduction to that newest book, that in fact by being open about such a positive discourse on migration, Steve Werther is keeping alive the idea of the opposite. Okay, the idea that there is a possible danger of societal disintegration and so on and so forth. I think that's quite far-fetched.
Because the concept always invokes its negative.
Yeah.
That's the idea behind it.
Yeah, but how can you then
talk at all?
Things like that. So yes, there is. There are animosities around the concept. Perhaps partly to do with the fact that